The village was still burning when the chains went on. Smoke clung low to the ground, thick and bitter, turning the air into something you could almost chew. The huts had already collapsed inward, their thatch roofs smoldering into blackened ribs. Bodies lay where they had fallen, some face down in ash, others twisted beside the broken fences that once marked out a quiet place of gathering. A few fires still snapped and cracked, but most had settled into a dull, suffocating glow. And among the ruin, men were being dragged upright. Those who had survived the raid did not look like survivors. Their hands were bound behind their backs with rough cord, wrists already cut open from the strain. Iron collars hung loose at first, then tightened with a single, brutal pull. The sound of metal locking into place carried across the burned ground, sharp and final. They were being taken. Some stumbled forward under the blows of armed men, barefoot on scorched earth. Others were forced to their knees and yanked up again when they could not move fast enough. A woman cried out, not a scream, not even loud, but raw and hollow, as she reached toward someone already being dragged away. No one answered her. The raiders did not hurry. They had done this before. Beyond the broken edge of the village, the line of captives began to form, a slow, uneven procession of bodies pulled toward the road. Chains linked them together, one to the next, so that when one fell, the others were jerked off balance with him. The sound of iron scraping against iron echoed under the low sky. And then, through the smoke, someone arrived, too late. Patrick did not run when he saw it. He stopped. His feet sank slightly into the damp soil where the fire had not yet reached, the edge of destruction still soft underfoot. He stood just beyond the worst of it, where the air shifted between smoke and cold wind, and he did not move closer at first. His eyes moved slowly across the scene, across the bodies, the ash, the broken doorways that no longer led anywhere. Then he saw the chains, not as an object, as a memory. For a moment, nothing else existed, not the burning, not the men with weapons, not even the survivors being driven forward. Only that unmistakable shape of iron against human skin, the weight, the cold, the certainty that once it closed, there was no negotiation left. His breath caught, but he did not look away. He stepped forward. The heat struck him immediately, the edge of the fire still alive enough to push against his face and arms. Ash shifted under his sandals as he crossed into the village itself. The smell grew heavier. Burned wood, burned grain, something else beneath it that he refused to name. A man lay near the entrance, half turned toward the road as if he had tried to crawl. Patrick knelt beside him, one hand hovering before finally resting against the man's shoulder. The skin was still warm, too recent. He looked up again toward the line of captives. They were already being driven farther away, toward the narrow road that cut through the low hills. A few turned their heads as they moved, searching, hoping, but there was nothing left behind them to return to. Patrick stood slowly. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from something deeper, something that pressed upward from his chest and refused to stay contained. He turned once more, taking in the full weight of what had happened here. Not a battle, not a clash of armies, a taking. And then, without another word, he left the bodies where they lay and walked toward the edge of the village where his satchel had been dropped. The parchment inside was already marked with earlier notes, names, places, fragments of a mission that had never felt simple, but had at least felt possible. He pulled it free now with unsteady hands, the edges curling slightly from the damp air. He did not sit. He stood in the open, the smoke still drifting behind him, and began to write. The first lines came fast, almost without thought, driven by something too urgent to wait for careful phrasing. The ink dragged slightly against the rough surface as his hand pressed harder than it needed to, each stroke cutting deeper into the page. He wrote of what he had seen, of those who had been killed, of those who had been taken, of the men responsible. But as the words formed, something shifted. This was not just a report, not a record to be passed quietly from one place to another. The anger in his chest did not allow for that. The memory of the chains, of what they meant, of what they did to a person, would not let him soften the language. He named them. He named Coroticus. The letters carved themselves into the parchment, one after another, until the name sat there with nowhere to hide, not a rumor, not a whisper, an accusation. Patrick paused only once, his hand hovering above the page. The wind moved slightly through the ruined village, lifting a thin line of ash into the air before letting it settle again. Somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of the marching captives carried back to him. Chains, footsteps, a voice cut short. He closed his eyes. For a moment, he was not standing in the ruins of this village. He was somewhere else, younger, helpless, dragged. The memory came without warning and without mercy. Rough hands, the sudden violence of being taken from everything familiar, the dark, suffocating hold of a ship where the air never seemed to move, the cold that followed when the sea finally released him onto a land that did not speak his language and did not care that he had lost everything. He had been one of them once, one of the chained. His hand tightened around the edge of the parchment. When he opened his eyes again, the present rushed back in, the burned huts, the scattered bodies, the line of captives already disappearing into the distance. And with it came something else, something that had not been there before, a decision. He bent over the parchment again and continued writing, but now the words carried a different weight. Not just outrage, but responsibility. Not just memory, but action. He would not let this pass. The letter grew longer, sharper. He spoke not only of the violence, but of the betrayal it represented. Men who claimed power, who claimed authority, who used it to enslave those who had only just begun to believe they were free. He did not soften the truth. He did not protect the names. Each line pressed forward, refusing to retreat into safety. By the time he stopped, the light had shifted. The smoke had thinned enough to reveal more of the damage beneath it, the full extent of what had been done. The fires would burn out eventually. The bodies would be buried. The ground would recover in its own slow way. But the people taken would not return. Patrick rolled the parchment carefully, though his hands still shook. He tied it with a strip of cloth from his satchel, pulling the knot tight as if it needed to hold more than just paper together. This was not the first time Ireland had taken lives. He knew that better than most. But this time, something had changed. He was no longer the boy who had been carried away in chains. He was the man who had come back. And now, standing in the ruins of what had been built, he understood that returning had not been the end of the story. It had been the beginning of something far more dangerous. Because what had been done to him once, quietly, without consequence, had now been done again. And this time, he would answer. Before he ever stood in the ash of someone else's captivity, Patrick had stood in his own. He had not been born with iron around his neck. He had not begun as the kind of man who could look at chains and understand their full weight. He was a boy first, a boy with a home, a family, a coastline he knew by sight, and the careless confidence of someone who believed the world around him would remain where it had always been. Then the raiders came. They came from the sea, where danger could appear without warning. One moment the coast belonged to wind, gulls, and the ordinary noise of human life. The next, strange men were moving through the dark with blades, ropes, and practiced hands. Doors were forced open. Bodies were shoved to the ground. Voices rose and broke in the confusion. Patrick was 16, old enough to understand terror, too young to have any power against it. He was seized before he could make sense of what was happening. Hands closed around his arms. Someone struck him hard enough to send light bursting behind his eyes. He heard shouting, but not words he could hold on to. He saw faces flash past, his own people, frightened and scattered, some running toward the fields, others dragged back before they could disappear into the night. Then he was pulled away from them. That was the first violence, not the blow, not the rope, not even the ship waiting in darkness, but separation, the sudden tearing of a life into before and after, a doorway he could not reach, a voice he could not answer, the terrible speed with which home became something behind him. He was driven toward the shore with others, stumbling over stones, salt wind cutting across his face. The sea did not look like escape, it looked like a mouth. The ship waited low in the water, dark against the darker tide. Men pushed captives aboard as if loading animals. Patrick's foot slipped on wet wood. Someone behind him fell and was kicked until he rose again. The hold smelled of fear, sweat, rope, and old water. When the hatch closed above them, the last thin strip of sky disappeared. No one came to bring him home. The crossing did not feel like travel. It felt like being erased. In the dark belly of the ship, Patrick could not measure distance except by sickness and sound. The boards groaned beneath him. Water struck the hull again and again. Men muttered prayers, curses, names of mothers, names of places already too far away to matter. Some were silent, and their silence was worse. He did not know where they were taking him. He only knew he was being taken. When the ship finally reached land, it was not mercy. The air outside was colder than he expected, the sky wide and hard above a place that did not know him. Ireland did not welcome him with legend, or green beauty, or holy purpose. It received him as property. He was sold into labor. There are losses the body understands before the mind can name them. Hunger, cold, exhaustion, the ache of muscles forced past their limit, the humiliation of being ordered where to stand, when to move, when to sleep, when to rise. Patrick learned these things not as ideas, but through skin and bone. He was sent into the hills to tend animals. The work was lonely in a way that became physical. Days stretched beneath heavy skies. Rain soaked through his clothing and stayed there. Wind pressed against him until his face burned. Mud pulled at his feet. The animals moved slowly over rough ground, indifferent to his fear, while he followed them through grass, stone, and cold. At night, the darkness was not gentle. He slept where he could, or did not sleep at all. The ground was hard, the air bit through him. Every sound beyond the herd could become a threat. A branch breaking, a distant shout, the movement of something unseen in the brush. He would wake with his heart hammering, not knowing whether he had dreamed danger or heard it. No familiar hand touched his shoulder. No familiar voice called his name. The boy who had once belonged somewhere now belonged to someone. At first, his inner life collapsed into survival. Food, warmth, shelter. The next command, the next step. He had little room for anything larger. Shame came in waves. Shame that he had been taken. Shame that he was helpless. Shame that whatever strength he thought he had possessed had disappeared under the weight of another man's will. But suffering does not always produce holiness first. Sometimes it produces anger. Patrick must have known that anger. The kind that burns hot in the chest when the rain is falling and no one sees you. The kind that imagines escape, revenge, rescue, anything except another day of obedience under humiliation. He was not yet the saint people would later remember. He was a captive boy in a hard land, with cold hands, an empty stomach, and no proof that God had not forgotten him. The hills did not answer his questions. The animals did not pity him. The seasons turned, and still he remained. And yet, under that pressure, something began to move. Not quickly, not beautifully, not in a way that made his suffering less real. It came in the dark first, when there was nothing else left. A prayer, then another. Not polished words, not the confident speech of someone who feels close to heaven. More like breath forced through pain. He prayed because there was nowhere else for his fear to go. He prayed in the rain. He prayed on the hillside. He prayed while watching animals move like shadows through mist. He prayed when sleep would not come. He prayed when the cold made his body shake so hard that words became almost impossible. And slowly, the silence around him changed. Not outwardly. The fields remained fields. The wind remained wind. The man who owned him did not become kind. The labor did not end. But inside the captivity, Patrick began to discover a place no captor could enter. This did not make him free. That is the danger of telling his story too gently. Prayer did not unlock the chain. It did not return him to his family. It did not shorten the hill road or soften the mud beneath his feet. It did not remove the ache from his back or the loneliness from his nights. Something changed, but not his situation. Years passed. The boy became leaner, harder, quieter. His hands roughened. His body learned the landscape. He knew the moods of weather by smell and pressure. He knew how quickly warmth could leave a body when clothing stayed wet. He knew the distance between one human shelter and another, and how a night could stretch when no roof stood above him. But he also knew now that he was not only what had happened to him. That knowledge was small at first, almost fragile. It did not erase fear. It stood beside fear. It did not erase longing. It gave longing a direction. Then came the dream. In the darkness of one night, when the hills lay still and the animals shifted softly nearby, Patrick heard what he believed was a voice. Not a public command, not a spectacle, something intimate and terrifying in its clarity. His ship was ready. The words did not make sense at first. A ship meant a coast. A coast meant distance. Distance meant roads, danger, hunger, discovery. It meant leaving without permission. It meant becoming a fugitive before becoming free. And yet the thought lodged in him like a hook. His ship was ready. The next day the hills looked the same, but they were no longer only hills. Every ridge had become a question. Every road he glimpsed in the distance had become a possible path. Every stranger could be a threat. Every mile between him and the sea became something he could almost feel pressing against his chest. Escape was not a dream of comfort. It was a risk that could kill him. If he stayed, he knew the shape of his misery. If he ran, he might vanish into a worse one. That was the choice before him. Not freedom or slavery, but known captivity or unknown danger. Still, the voice would not leave him. So Patrick fled. He left behind the animals, the hills, the life that had been forced onto him. He moved through a land that did not become safe just because he had decided to cross it. The road to the coast was long, and every step could expose him. He had no army, no escort, no certainty that the vision had not been desperation wearing the mask of hope. Fields opened and closed around him. Paths narrowed through rough ground. Cold settled into his clothing. Hunger returned as a familiar enemy. At times, the only thing carrying him forward was the memory of the words that had awakened him. His ship was ready. When he finally reached the coast, the sea lay before him again. The same sea that had swallowed his old life. This time, it held the possibility of return. But possibility is not welcome. It must be negotiated, begged for, fought for. The ship he found was not waiting with open arms. Men looked at him with suspicion. A runaway slave was danger. A stranger without status was trouble. The captain had every reason to refuse him, and at first, he did. Patrick stood there on the edge of the shore, with the wind cutting across his face, and the vessel close enough to see, yet still unreachable. After all the miles, after all the hunger, after the dream and the risk and the terrifying act of flight, he could still be turned back. The coast did not promise him anything. Behind him was the land that had enslaved him. Before him was a ship that might not take him. And between the two stood a young man who had survived captivity, only to learn that escape could still fail at the final step. The refusal struck harder, because Patrick had allowed himself to hope. The sea was there, gray and restless, breathing against the shore as if it had no memory of what it had done to him years before. The ship rocked in the water, close enough for him to see the lines, the worn wood, the men moving across the deck. After so long in the hills, after mud and hunger and fear, the sight of it should have met rescue. Instead, the captain looked at him and said no. Patrick stood on the shore with nothing in his hands that could purchase mercy. The wind pulled at his clothing, salt stung his face. Behind him stretched the land he had escaped, a land of roads where any man could recognize him, seize him, return him. Ahead of him floated the only visible way out, and it was being denied. For a moment, the old captivity closed around him again. Not the chain itself, but the feeling beneath it. The knowledge that another man's decision could decide the shape of his life. He could plead, but pleading was not power. He could explain, but explanation might expose him. He could run again, but where? Then the men on the ship reconsidered. Not cleanly, not warmly, not as if heaven had opened and made them gentle. They called him back after he had turned away, and the call itself must have felt almost unreal. Patrick moved toward the ship, each step carrying the danger that they might change their minds again. He climbed aboard not as a triumphant fugitive, but as a desperate young man whose escape still depended on strangers. The boards beneath his feet were wet. The ropes smelled of salt and tar. Around him, men glanced with suspicion, measuring whether he was useful, dangerous, or cursed. When the ship pulled away from the Irish shore, Patrick did not become free all at once. He became someone leaving. That is not the same thing. The crossing took him away from the place of his enslavement, but it could not return him unchanged. Even when he reached land again, even when the old world began to reappear in fragments, roads, speech, houses, the possibility of family, he carried Ireland in his body. The cold hills did not release him simply because the ship had, home, should have healed him quickly. It did not. The doorways were familiar, but he was not. Faces that had once belonged to ordinary affection now looked at him with shock, relief, pity, and questions too large for any room. A fire might have burned on the hearth. Food might have been placed before him. Hands might have reached for his shoulders, his face, his hair, as if touch could confirm that he had truly returned. But the boy who had been taken had not come back whole. At night, when the house settled into silence, Patrick would have known the difference between shelter and peace. A roof could keep off rain, but it could not quiet memory. A bed could hold the body, but it could not make the body forget the ground. The crackle of fire could become the sound of burning villages. A door closing could become the thud of a hatch above a slave ship. He was home, but he was not finished. Those around him might have wanted him to stay there, to rebuild what had been stolen, to live quietly, to let the years in Ireland become a wound covered by ordinary life. Who would blame them? The family that lost him had received him back. The sensible thing was to keep him. The merciful thing, in human terms, was never to let him near that shore again. But mercy was beginning to cost more than safety. The call came not as comfort, but as disturbance. In the quiet of returned life, Patrick heard Ireland again, not as a captor this time, but as a cry. In dreams, in restless nights, in the space between sleep and waking, he sensed voices from the land he had escaped. Not the voices of masters, not the voices of raiders, the voices of those still in darkness. They seemed to call him back. This was the contradiction that would define him. The place of his humiliation became the place of his summons. The land that had stripped him of name, status, and freedom became the land he could not forget. Every reasonable instinct in him must have resisted it. Every memory had an argument against return. The road, the hunger, the men who owned other men, the cold hills, the language of command, the terror of being powerless. To return was not romantic. It was not the neat bravery of legend. It was a man placing his hand back on the door that had once closed on him. He delayed. He wrestled. He was not made of stone. Obedience did not erase dread. Somewhere in the hidden chambers of his mind, the captive boy was still alive, and that boy knew exactly what Ireland could do. Yet the call did not loosen. So Patrick prepared, not as a conqueror preparing to seize a land, but as a wounded man preparing to re-enter the scene of his wound without becoming ruled by it. He learned what he could. He prayed through resistance. He accepted that the return would not be understood by everyone, perhaps not even by those who loved him. The mission did not begin with public glory. It began in rooms where he could not sleep, in silence where memory argued against obedience. When he crossed the sea again, it was no longer as stolen cargo. This time he chose the ship. That choice did not make the water gentle. The waves still rose beneath the hull. Wind still strained against sail and rope. The same sea that had once carried him into bondage now carried him back toward danger by his own consent. He stood on the deck as Ireland drew closer, and whatever courage people later gave him in memory, it must have trembled in the body first. The coast appeared, not as a nightmare now, but not as welcome either. The land lay under a shifting sky, green and hard, beautiful and threatening at once. Patrick stepped onto it with the strange knowledge that he had returned, voluntarily, to the place from which he had once fled for his life. The ground did not remember his suffering. The hills did not bow. The wind moved over him as coldly as before. But he was no longer only a survivor. He had come with a message. The first encounters did not unfold like victory. There were no crowds rushing forward in gratitude, no open roads cleared for him, no easy proof that the call had been wise. He entered a world of tribal power, local suspicion, and old loyalties guarded by men who did not welcome outsiders telling them what was holy. Faces watched him from doorways. Men gathered at halls and thresholds, weighing him with narrowed eyes. Fires burned in enclosed spaces where leaders sat among their people, measuring danger in every stranger. Patrick's speech, his bearing, his purpose, all of it marked him. He knew enough of the land to move through it, but he was not one of them. He had been captive there. Now he returned claiming to bring truth. That made him more than strange. It made him disruptive. Near ritual places, among stones, fires, and the old signs of power, tension thickened around him. He could feel it in the pauses before men answered. He could see it in the way hands rested near weapons, in the way a crowd could grow quiet when he approached. Curiosity and hostility often wore the same face. They did not just reject him, they watched him. The mission became a road of exposure. Patrick moved from settlement to settlement, carrying no empire behind him strong enough to make obedience easy. Rain soaked the roads. Mud clung to his feet. Nights were uncertain. A friendly fire in one place could be followed by a cold refusal in the next. One household might listen. Another might mock. A local ruler might tolerate him today and threaten him tomorrow. Every mile placed his body back under the old knowledge of vulnerability. He had escaped being property, but he had not escaped danger. There were moments when exhaustion would have stripped away every noble word. A tired body does not think in grand histories. It thinks of the next hill, the next meal, the next dry place to sleep. Patrick's mission moved through aching legs, wet clothes, hunger, and the constant awareness that he could be taken again. And beneath the outward danger ran a deeper wound. Accusation followed him. Not everyone trusted his motives. Not everyone believed his calling. Even among those who shared his faith, there were questions about his past, his education, his authority, his worthiness. The shame of youth, captivity, and inadequacy did not vanish just because he obeyed. It returned in new clothing, spoken now through the mouths of critics. Who was he to lead? Who was he to teach? Who was he to stand before kings, chieftains, warriors, and households with authority? These questions did not remain outside him. They entered him. They found old rooms already prepared by humiliation. The captive boy in the hills had long ago learned what it meant to feel small, unguarded, and unimportant. Now the missionary heard echoes of that same smallness in public doubt. The outer opposition met the inner wound. That collision could have broken him differently. He might have become hard, eager to dominate the land that once dominated him. He might have hidden his fear beneath anger. He might have turned his survival into contempt for those who still lived as his captors had lived. But Patrick's return demanded something more terrible than courage. It demanded that he refuse revenge. He had to stand among people who reminded him of his suffering and not reduce them to the worst thing done to him. He had to preach mercy without pretending evil was harmless. He had to remember the chain without becoming chained to hatred. That was not softness. It was a daily violence against the part of him that had every reason to withdraw, condemn, or run. Still, the mission grew. Not smoothly, not safely, but visibly. There were baptisms. Households changed. Young believers emerged in places where Patrick had once known only fear. The faith he carried began to take root in the very soil where his own captivity had unfolded. Each conversion must have brought joy, but also risk, because every soul who stepped forward became visible. Every new believer could become a target. Every public change disturbed old powers. And old powers do not always answer with argument. Sometimes they answer with force. The danger returned first as rumor, then as movement. Men loyal to Coroticus, armed and hardened, came against Patrick's newly converted people. The attack did not fall on an abstract mission. It fell on bodies, on men and women whose faces Patrick knew, on people who had stood in water, who had prayed, who had begun to believe that their lives now belonged to a mercy stronger than fear. Then the killing began. The settlement was struck with brutal speed. Smoke rose where ordinary life had been. Cries broke against the noise of weapons. Some of the newly baptized were cut down. Others were seized alive, their wrists bound, their freedom stripped from them in a single morning of violence. When the survivors were chained and driven away, Patrick's past stood in front of him again, not as memory, not as dream, but as living flesh. The evil that had taken him as a boy had returned for his children in the faith. And now the men responsible were not distant shadows from his youth. They had a name. They had power. They had acted openly. Patrick looked at the burned ground, the bodies, the captives disappearing into the road, and the old wound opened with a force that could no longer remain private. This time, the chain was not around his neck. It was around theirs. And the final question of his life stood before him with the weight of iron, whether he would grieve in silence or accuse the powerful aloud. Patrick did not answer the attack with a sword. That may sound like restraint from a distance, the kind of clean, moral image that later generations can admire without feeling its cost. But in the smoke of that settlement, restraint was not calm. It was agony under discipline. His followers had been killed. Others had been dragged away alive. The chains that had once closed around his own life had now closed around people he had baptized, taught, prayed over, and loved. He had returned to Ireland to bring mercy. Now mercy was bleeding in the mud. The bodies had to be faced first. There is no public courage that does not begin with the unbearable work of looking. Patrick moved among the dead, with the ash still shifting underfoot, seeing not a crowd, not a cause, but faces. These were not symbols of missionary suffering. They were people who had stood in the fragile beginning of faith and been struck down before that beginning could deepen into ordinary years. Some had been killed soon after receiving baptism. That fact tore at him. The water had barely dried from their heads before violence found them. The prayers were still new in their mouths. Their lives, which should have opened outward, had been cut short or seized. Somewhere on the road, survivors were being marched away under guard, their hands bound, their bodies forced forward toward the market of human possession. Patrick knew too well what waited for them. He knew the first humiliation, the inventory of bodies, the rough calculation of strength, age, usefulness. He knew the way fear changed when a person understood that others were discussing him as property. He knew how quickly a name could be buried beneath another man's command. And because he knew, he could not pretend this was only political violence or tribal conflict or the ordinary brutality of the age. It was theft of souls. He went to the parchment because his body could not reach the captives fast enough. His words would have to travel where his hands could not. But writing was not safe. A private lament might have comforted the grieving and cost him little. A cautious appeal might have allowed powerful men to ignore him without losing face. But Patrick did not write as a man trying to preserve his place. He wrote as one who had seen evil return wearing a familiar shape. The letter began in grief and became accusation. He denounced Coroticus and the men who followed him. He condemned those who had murdered the newly baptized and sold the survivors into slavery. He did not hide behind vague language. He did not dissolve guilt into the mist of unfortunate events. He set the crime in the open and forced its name into public hearing. That was the risk. Once written, such words could not be called back. They would travel through hands, mouths, and memory. They could turn allies away. They could provoke retaliation. They could mark Patrick as dangerous, not because he carried weapons, but because he refused to let respectable violence remain respectable. The pen moved across the page, but behind every line stood the boy in chains, not controlling him, answering through him. He remembered the ship's darkness, the cold hills, the hunger, the long years in which no one came. He remembered how captivity had tried to reduce him to labor and silence. Now others were being pushed into that same darkness, and the temptation would have been to collapse under grief, to say the world had always been cruel, to accept that some powers could not be confronted. But Patrick had not returned to become silent in the presence of chains. He wrote with the urgency of a man who understood that the captives might never read his words, but their captors would hear them. The dead could not speak. The enslaved might be carried beyond reach. So he spoke where they could not. He called the crime what it was. He treated the victims not as losses to his reputation, but as beloved members of a body that had been wounded. That mattered. In a world where slaves could be treated as spoils, Patrick insisted on their dignity with public force. The people taken were not goods, they were not prizes, they were not nameless casualties of stronger men's ambition. They were his brothers and sisters, and because of that, the wound was no longer private. This was the final shape of his return, not the first decision to step back onto Irish soil, not the first sermon before suspicious faces, not the first night spent on an unsafe road. The true test came when the evil that had once defined his own suffering appeared again, this time inflicted on those under his care. A survivor can spend a lifetime fleeing the place where pain began. Patrick had done the opposite. He returned. But return alone was not enough. The deeper question was what he would do when the past did not remain past. Would he soften his words to keep access to the powerful? Would he protect the mission's fragile position by refusing to offend men with swords? Would he tell himself that grief was holy enough, that outrage could be left inside the heart? The parchment answered, no. The declaration against Coroticus was not merely anger. It was a boundary drawn in the open. Patrick placed himself between the captives and the men who would reduce them to profit. He could not break every chain with his hands, but he could refuse to let the chain be blessed, excused, or hidden. That refusal changed him in public. The boy, once taken, had become the defender of the taken. The slave had become the accuser of enslavers. And the man who had every human reason to hate Ireland had given his life there so completely that the suffering of its newest believers became his own. The aftermath did not arrive like triumph. There was no clean ending in which every captive returned, every guilty man repented, and every wound was healed while the smoke still hung in the air. History rarely gives that kind of mercy. Patrick's letter stands because the wound remained serious enough to demand witness. He continued, that may be the most difficult part to understand. After the raid, after the letter, after the grief, he did not vanish into bitterness. He remained in the land that had once enslaved him and now had wounded him again to the suffering of others. He kept traveling roads that could turn hostile. He kept entering settlements where suspicion waited. He kept speaking to people who might listen one day and threaten him the next. His mission was not made easier by suffering. It was made more costly. The years that followed cannot be reduced to a gentle legend. The Ireland Patrick served was not a painted background for pious memory. It was a land of rival powers, dangerous loyalties, old customs, hunger, weather, and human fear. His work moved through mud, smoke, doorways, halls, fields, and crossings. It moved through conversations where one wrong word could close a village against him. It moved through exhaustion and accusation. It moved through the stubborn belief that grace could enter even places marked by violence. And slowly, the memory of the captive boy became inseparable from the mission of the bishop. Not because trauma disappeared, because it was transformed into vigilance. Patrick's authority did not come from being untouched by suffering. It came from having passed through humiliation without allowing humiliation to become his master. He knew what it was to be powerless, and that knowledge made him dangerous to those who used power without mercy. He knew what chains did to the soul, and that knowledge made him unable to speak softly when chains returned. This is why the story cannot end merely with escape. Escape would have made him a survivor. Return made him a witness. But the Coroticus crisis made him something more severe. A man willing to confront in public the same evil that had once swallowed him in private. The opening contradiction remained to the end. He was kidnapped as a teenager, carried into bondage, and shaped in the loneliness of a foreign land. Then, against every instinct of self-protection, he went back to the people among whom his suffering had begun. He did not go back because the wound was small. He went back because the call became larger than the wound. And when chains appeared again, he did not look away. That is the hard center of Patrick's story. Not shamrocks, not softened legend, not the polished memory of a saint who was always ready for holiness. A frightened boy was taken from home. A slave learned to pray in the cold. A fugitive crossed the sea. A wounded man heard the voices of the land that had broken him. A missionary returned. And when the old evil rose again against those he loved, he answered with the full force of a conscience forged in captivity. The final image is not peaceful in the easy sense. It is Patrick with parchment in his hands, smoke behind him, chains ahead of him, the dead at his feet, the powerful named in ink, and the boy he once was, standing somewhere inside the man he had become, not erased, not forgotten, but finally no longer silent.